And I think we're live with Justin Khoe. Thank you, Justin, for joining us today. Mary Ellen is unable to join us today. She's been unwell this week, but we're very excited to have you here, Justin. And wow, we've got a lot to talk about. So first of all, thank you for being here.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. I started to grow my hair out again in anticipation for the next time I go down to Australia. First time I was there, I had the man bun. Second time I was cleaner cut, and now I'm working back towards that in anticipation that it'll secure me another invitation to Australia.
Heading back in that direction. Well, it's, as you know, there's been lockdowns and quarantines, and I probably haven't had a haircut for 6 months plus, so I'm growing mine out as well at the moment.
There you go. It's looking good on you.
Oh, I don't know. I'll have to check with my wife on that one.
There we go.
But yeah, Justin, it's great to have you on today, and thank you for being willing. I know the time zone there. You're in Oregon, is that right?
Yep, it's a little after 9 p.m. right now.
All right, so it's not super late at night, but it is sort of later and outside of business hours. And yeah, we really appreciate you joining us at Adventist Record today. The reason we're chatting with you, Justin, is because there's a really exciting project that you've been a part of. It's partly supported by the North America division and the Adventist learning community. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's not just partly, it's entirely supported by them. And so we are very grateful to both entities for giving us a shot with something that's maybe a little new for Adventism. Yep.
So the NAD, I think we're familiar with. We sort of understand what a world division of the church is. Can you give us just in a nutshell, Adventist learning community? What is that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know the technical definition, but I can tell you kind of what it's meant to a lot of us.
Yes.
The Adventist learning community has been a way for people to get continuing education, I believe, about a variety of subjects. It's one of the ways to try and utilize technology to service people that are out there in the field. And so most traditionally, it seems like they'll get experts in their respective fields, come to the studio, which is located not too far from Andrews University, and they'll film, a webinar. They'll film maybe a more professionally produced kind of teaching session or something along those lines. So that's kind of how I understand it normally works. But in addition to that, it really is, for all intents and purposes, the body that is empowering Adventist creatives, at least in the States, perhaps more than any entity that I'm aware of. They've helped to back several podcasts, for example. There's, Advent Next. I know that is a kind of part of that general cohort. There's a handful of podcasts I know that Caleb would be mentioning if he was here with us tonight, but I'll have to keep that under wraps so that he could be the one to talk to you about that. They're constantly open to creatives pitching them their next creative idea. And so as it were at Society of Adventist Communicators not too long ago, this is where the conversation of partnering with Humans of Adventism kind of came along. And, obviously I'm not the face of Humans of Adventism, but I do work with Caleb very closely. And this was kind of where the vision of a documentary was kind of born. And to our pleasant surprise, they were like, yes, we want to see this. We love the vision. This is something that we think would be valuable out there in the space. So what do we need to make it work? And they have been awesome partners to work with.
Yeah, well, I think a lot of creatives sort of down under would be excited to hear something like that is existing in the States. I don't think we have anything quite along those lines here in the South Pacific division. But it certainly gives us something to think about or strive towards potentially down here. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that one of the things that makes it so, at least what it feels very groundbreaking on our side of things, is the openness to kind of the creative interpretation of our team. A lot of times working with the church, it really feels, and I don't mean this pejoratively, but you kind of end up selling your soul to a project, right? Where you end up, a friend of mine says that when he works for the church, he feels like he's a professional record button, where all he does is hit record and documents what they want to communicate. And there's a space for that. I'm not knocking that, but it just doesn't feel creatively fulfilling when you have a paintbrush in your hand, but someone is holding your hand and directing your hand as you paint. It doesn't really feel as authentic. But in this situation, they have pretty much said, go for it. Like, what is it that you want to do? We create the proposal. And rather than it being something that, we're producing on behalf of, it really is a partnership. It is kind of a contractor employee. And so there's really the best of both worlds, in which the ALC gets the benefit of a project that's really important, that will serve, its constituency. And at the same time, our creative team really feels very fulfilled in being able to be a part of this project.
Yeah, and to have the support and the partnership of the NAD is really exciting as well.
Absolutely.
I guess we're jumping ahead a little bit. Let's rewind and look at Humans of Adventism. So it was initially started as a sort of Humans of New York style ministry or page, even social media presence, which just told the stories of Adventists around the world, really, many based in the States, but there was some, I've seen profiles of people even from New Zealand and Australia on on that channel. And so Humans of Adventism has been around for a few years, but this new sort of iteration of it, this documentary series, tell us a little bit about that and the purpose behind creating it. You, I understand, did some of the cinematography, helped with filming the documentary, helped Caleb. It was kind of his brainchild, but what's the sort of the reason behind the documentary and the purpose, and why should people check it out?
So I think that it's maybe too common of an experience to walk into a church on a given Sabbath, obviously pre-COVID-19, to walk into a church on Sabbath to say, hi, happy Sabbath, how are you? How are the kids? What lovely weather we're having. Then to sit down to sing a few hymns, listen to the sermon, eat your haystack, and then be gone. And, without intentionality, this can kind of become the routine that happens week after week, year after year, where you're in the same church for 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years, maybe, sitting next to the same people that you've seen grow up from the same age that you were, all the while not really developing meaningful and lasting relationships and connections with these people. The format of church as we know it right now doesn't seem to be finely tuned for developing deep human interactions. And so one of the things that I know that Caleb has experienced in doing a lot of these human interest blogs on his Facebook or Instagram is oftentimes people will say, man, I finally saw someone on the page that I've known for a decade or two, and they shared a story that I never heard about. And this is a fairly common experience. I know that in Oregon, with Oregon Adventists on the Facebook page there, one of the things that's a common experience is we tell the stories of pastors kind of outside of the realm of pastoring. So for example, Troy Wallace, who's a friend and a local pastor here in Oregon, had a whole life prior to ministry as a professional gambler. And so that's a whole aspect of his life that people don't know about and maybe just can't connect with because maybe they've never asked. And so the entire project really is, I think it accomplishes a couple things, but minimally it does create a sense, a more rounded sense of who we are as a people. Yes, we believe in the Sabbath. Yes, we, eat haystacks and we love Big Franks or things like that. And that's all great. But Adventists are a very complex and diverse group of people with so many different life experiences and so many different ways to relate to each other and the person out there on the outside of the church walls. And so I think it's meant to be a tool to connect people closer together.
Yeah, and you get that sense. I've watched not all of the series, but they're all available, and we'll give people the details shortly. But I've watched a few of them, and it does give that sense of I'm sitting down and I'm having a conversation with with that person on the video. I'm getting to know them. I think Caleb in one of the videos speaks about it's a fairly slowed down pace. It's not a high, fast paced documentary, but I think that style gives it a conversational, a real life, I'm having a conversation with you sort of feel.
Yeah. Yeah. The internet is so fine-tuned for jump cuts and rapid pacing when it comes to video. If you sit down and watch the
Yep.
latest Mr. Beast video, you know, the scene is going to change every 3 seconds and it's just going to be all constantly flying at you. And that's great. And it's entertaining and it's awesome in its own kind of unique art form. But yeah, you're right. The documentary is intentionally slowed down. We intentionally have longer drawn out cuts. The music is specifically picked to not increase the pace. It really is the kind of thing that you sit down and you really take your time with, like you would with a good meal. You enjoy it, you chew it, you savor every single moment of it. And really the hope is that through this series, you have an insight to a person's life. We are very intentional on where we shot every episode. For example, a lot of these episodes are taking place in people's homes or at their place of work or at the school that they grew up in. And so you're getting an insight to what the world could look like if you were in fact in front of that person. In fact, that's really what we're going for creatively, is you to feel like you're sitting down in front of maybe your grandmother during a story time, something along those lines, where nothing else matters in this moment. You're not distracted by the latest blog that's come out. You know, your text messages aren't like popping off. Like, you really are just sitting in a space and hearing a person's story. And by doing that, hopefully it deepens your appreciation for that person. It deepens your relationship to this community overall.
And yeah, I can resonate with that, because I tried to watch on the past Sabbath. I was sitting down and I was like, hey, I need to check out this documentary. And I attempted to, but my wife needed something. The baby started crying. I couldn't. It's not something I can just consume, I guess, instant. It's not instant like entertainment, escapist consumption. I had to sit, and I wanted to sit and dwell with it, because I was like, hey, I'm not really getting this just trying to quickly watch it while other stuff is going on in my house. I actually have to switch all the other channels in my life off to sync my mind into this moment. And I think that's a good thing.
What do you think about it? What was it about the series that really drew you in this way, that felt different than other pieces of media that you've consumed?
Look, I think that the people, it doesn't sort of try and give you gimmicks. It's not flashy music. It's not as you say, the quick cuts and the entertainment value. It's someone sharing. And at least when I sat down to watch the episode, it was immediately into sort of deep conversation, what you might have with a friend after you've had the meal. You've been chatting about the sport and the weather, and then you're into that level of conversation a couple of hours in to the day. You know, you can't have those conversations sort of on the fly. You have to invest in them. And I think for me, that was like, hang on, this is something I need to sit and sit with, you know, dwell with. And I think that's important in this day and age, which is so rapid fire, as you say. It's good to just have that moment to understand and to listen. I think that's really important.
Absolutely. Yeah, we feel the same way. Every one of those interviews is an hour, maybe 2 hours long, and each of these person's stories gets chopped to pieces to be 3 or 4 minutes a piece. But there's a whole backstory taking place with every interview that's taking place. Oftentimes, you know, we're actually meeting the person that we're filming for the first time. And so we really have to figure out, how do we get into, like you're saying, these deeper, more meaningful and substantive conversations fairly quickly. You know, you set up the cameras, you know, you've maybe walked around the city block, you know, once or twice trying to find a good location to shoot, but eventually the camera starts rolling and it's like, okay, so where do we start? And one of the things that I found that was so pleasantly surprising was how willing people were to go deep. And maybe it's just because the kinds of people that would, you know, be willing to jump on a documentary are inherently deep people. Maybe it's just the followers of Humans of Adventism are inherently deep thinkers, perhaps. But I'd like to think it's a more universal lesson that every single human being has this capacity for depth, has this capacity for meaning. And so I think that for me, that's actually one of the things I take away from this kind of experience is,
Mm.
how many times do I miss a person's true heart simply
Yeah.
because I'm distracted in that moment? How many times do I miss a beautiful moment to connect with someone simply because I'm in a hurry to go to the next thing?
And in your experience, would you say not just a capacity for depth, but a desire? Do you think we have
Yeah,
a desire to connect?
I think so. I think so. I think maybe there's some people, some of us who are scared of depth, who are scared of
Mm.
commitment. But I think oftentimes what happens is if you experience that in a safe place with someone
Mhm.
who really doesn't have any intention of othering you, who has no intention of judging you negatively because of your story or experience,
Mm.
because so many of us have experienced trauma and pain. So many of us have had ups and downs, and so we are kind of pre-programmed in a day of Instagram highlight reels to only share the good, and
Mhm.
that's not necessarily evil. That's not necessarily wrong, but oftentimes there's a certain sense where it's the shared suffering that truly creates the strongest bonds. And I think a lot of times we're
Mm.
scared to share that with people. But when we are able to share ourselves and to truly be heard and to be truly be seen and to be understood without any judgment, I think the vast majority of people find that to be incredibly appetizing, incredibly satisfactory, because
Mm.
I think at the core of what it means to be human is we were made for connection. And so to be seen, to be heard, to actually experience that depth of relationship, it's refreshing for every single person that we got to participate on in this series with.
I'm sensing, Justin, when you share some of that, what you've just shared, there's something underneath that that's very, in a sense, theological. How we see God and how we understand, the study of God, theology, and that desire for connection in people, and some of that. Can you unpack the sort of the theology behind not only the Humans of Adventism docos, but I know some of your ministries is going into this, slowing down the pace, having conversations with people, accepting people, and trying to understand people's journeys. Can you share some of the sort of biblical reasons why that you see as very important?
Yeah, it's interesting when we think of ministry. All too often, I think we think of a person on a stage wearing a suit and tie, holding a book in their hand, speaking to a crowd. And not to say
Right.
that this isn't ministry, but in the book of Matthew, I think it's accurate to say there are no more than 5 sermons that are recorded. Um,
Mm-hmm.
the rest of the book is Jesus showing up in the lives of people. It's
Mm.
more so the ministry of presence than it is, the ministry of preaching. And when we realize that so often the stories that were recorded was when Jesus spent time with a person one-on-one or with a small group, it begins to shift how we see the best way to communicate the good news. It shifts how we can conceptualize how do we help a person realize their identity as a child of God. Um, and something that I've kind of been learning over the years, and this is in no small part due to Caleb's influence on me and
Mm.
being maybe even a recipient of Caleb's ministry of presence, is how much a listening ear can actually accomplish.
Mm.
So much of my ministry was in public evangelism or literature evangelism or Bible work, and so ministry for me was always the exchange of information that I had to the recipients. And again, I don't want to knock it. I don't want to say that these are bad things or evil things, but um, the thing that truly leads someone to change in their life seldom is information. There's
Mm.
a popular radio host in America, Dave Ramsey, who talks about, it's not about information. Otherwise, we would all be rich and have the bodies of athletes and all these things. It's like information only goes so far. It really, what it
Yeah.
comes down to is something deeper than just information. And I think what transforms is relationship.
Mm.
One of the verses that I've kind of come back to many times is that it's the goodness of God that brings someone to repentance. So in my mind, if I'm conceptualizing a strategy on how do I get my atheist friend to give Jesus a chance, how do I try to help someone realize that the way that they're living maybe isn't the healthiest way for them, and there's a better way to do it if they were to kind of model their life after Jesus. Shame, guilt, and condemnation might produce a change that's very potent in a moment, but oftentimes is very shallow. And that's why it doesn't say that that's actually how you lead someone to repentance. It's through the goodness of God. And so
Wow.
really what the ministry of presence is at its core is trying to help someone experience the goodness of God, God's long suffering, his patience, his kindness, his gentleness. And it's oftentimes very difficult for someone to feel all of those attributes of God, to feel the presence of God when they feel like they're being spoken down to, when they're being preached at or being condescended to. And so the ministry of presence is a radical thing. Unfortunately, maybe it shouldn't be radical, but it's a very powerful thing. It's been radical for me in the last couple of years to see what does it look like to show up in a person's life, to truly be there for them, to be patient, to be slow to speak, to be quick to listen. What does that do to a person's life? What does that do to their journey? And how does it actually work in a way that God can use it to bring about change?
So that's like, yeah, it really revolutionizes, I guess, the way we think about evangelism and the way we do church sometimes, to think in that sense, because as you say, there's a place for the outreach methods that we've done for many years, but we often we miss the mark when we treat people as targets, or where we have an agenda when we go in. But I think at the core of it, we all want people to find the joy that we have. We want a better life for people. And as you say, if someone's having health issues, whether it's addiction issues or whatever, if we've found an answer in the goodness of God in that space, we want to share that, but we're not always effective at how we share that, or we don't always know how to share that. And the easiest thing is sometimes to just do it in the same way that we've always done it. But this documentary sort of reimagines that by sharing Adventist stories and Adventist lives, but in I could say a non-confrontational kind of way, or an invitational is probably a better way of putting it, inviting people into the story to say, hey, this is my experience. This is what I've experienced, and I'm inviting you to listen and to understand that. Do you think, so some of the topics that you've covered is things like purpose, legacy, miracles. I'm really excited to watch the miracles one. I haven't watched that yet, but it sounds like a cool topic. Was there a choice to go with the themes, or did you find interesting people with interesting stories and then these themes sort of developed? Was the organizing principle to go, hey, we need to find people to cover these topics, or was it more organic than that?
Yeah, so the person to talk to about like really the fine details of how themes developed and the interview process is Caleb. I interject here and there and threw in a question once or twice, but that's largely Caleb's role, and that's really something that he's very gifted at. But being a part of this journey, I know that we started with a handful of subjects that we really wanted to cover, and it was fun to know that kind of backstory as I'm watching Caleb navigate through an interview. I know, for example, as we would be driving to an interview with someone that, we've been following this person's ministry online for several years, but haven't met in person. Caleb would oftentimes iterate, oh, there's a really unique moment that I want to capture on video with this person's story. I remember back when I was following this person's ministry, and they wrote this thing, or they said this thing on a stage, or they shared this story of their life. And Caleb really was kind of sitting down in hopes to grab that story, to document it for the purpose of the documentary. Right. And it's funny because he would oftentimes throw a softball up in the air, trying to set it up perfectly for them to be able to just like nail it with their story. And it would just be this beautiful moment. And oftentimes the way that the person had interpreted the question was very different. Or they just decided, you know what, there was something more kind of on the top of their mind, something that was so more impactful to them that they chose to share instead. And so early on in the interview process, as we're kind of learning what's happening, I would see Caleb kind of sit back and think a little bit more and maybe try to reformat the same question, but in a different way to try and get them to share the story that he originally wanted them to share. And there was a sense that this kept happening a handful of times, and there was a shift that took place in the documentary process where he kind of let go. Now, for me, I love spontaneity. I love when plans go up in smoke. I love the kind of just the hustle and the art of adjusting on the fly. To me, that's kind of where I feel in my element. And not to say that Caleb is bad at this, but Caleb is much more in his element when things are planned, when things have like a start and an end, and he can kind of see where things are going to be. But he had to embrace the chaos. How else do you get nearly 50 people's stories to all kind of interweave together and to tie one to another? Maybe he's that smart. I don't know, but I know that I couldn't do that. So he had to embrace the chaos at one point and just be willing to let people share what they chose to share in that moment. And as that happened, subjects that we thought would be talked about started to kind of disappear, and other subjects started to emerge. And at the end of it all, I'm really proud about it. I think that the episodes share a cohesive narrative, and they share many times even competing narratives within the same episode. Talking about values, for example, one person might say, this is a value that I really treasure. And the other person's like, I hate this value. I'm about this other thing. So there's this competition within its own episode arc that just highlights how different we are as a people group. And I think that's a beautiful thing to capture, that Adventism is a whole host of things. It's a cornucopia of people, if you will. Diverse backgrounds, diverse cultures, diverse point of views. That's true politically, that's true even theologically. And I think it's kind of cool to see that represented in the film.
What's your favorite story that you witnessed that's gone into the documentary, that someone that you just really resonated with, or that shocked you, or that just changed the way you think about things, something that stood out?
Yeah, so there's a handful of stories that I'm really personally tied to. So what my best friend in life right now was featured in the Converts episode, and he shares his story of kind of coming out of this kind of what is life? I'm not too sure, and he eventually finds Christ at a kind of like a Vespers service, so to speak. Documenting JR's story was super important to me because he's actually the guy that God used to really bring me to Christ. And so like being able to capture this moment, that if it wasn't for his story and if it wasn't for what happened in his life, like there's a sense in which that I wouldn't be here today.
Wow.
So that's important. That's a great story, and I love that story. But easily my favorite one is actually the episode on ministry, where I actually get to sit down and share a little bit of my story, but more importantly, document my grandfather's experience. My grandfather was born in the Philippines and the son of, at the time, a popular evangelist and church planter and pastor in the Philippines. And we got to hear stories that I've never heard before. I got a sense of what it was like to grow up in that era, but not really the details of it. And kind of like, one of the themes that emerged in this conversation with my grandfather was the cost that the family paid so that his father could stay in ministry. In a day where you couldn't Zoom your family, you couldn't FaceTime or text or anything like that. When my great grandfather would go away for an evangelistic crusade for a month at a time, it often meant that my grandfather didn't see him. And so when asked to share stories about my great grandfather, he didn't really have very many. And because the reality was he didn't really know his father very much, because ministry was the call and the family paid the price together. And that really hit home because, at the beginning of my ministry journey, like this is something that's happened for my family. I talk about how, my first year of marriage, I spent 167 days on the road, away from my wife. And so
Wow.
I have kind of an intimate experience with what it means to be willing to sacrifice for the sake of ministry.
Mm,
And so to be able to kind of capture all that was really meaningful.
yeah.
Last year, my grandmother passed away, and like in the months leading up to her kind of untimely demise, like I had oftentimes thought, you know what, my grandparents are getting older. I really should make a trip to California to bring the cameras and the microphones and sit down and just ask her stories about her life. You know, when's the last time I really had a long conversation with my grandma and just got to hear her life journey? What was it like growing up in the Philippines? What was it like getting married? How did you know that my grandpa was the one? You know, immigrating to the United States, that must have been hard. Can you tell me that story? I wanted to ask her so many things, but life
Mm,
happened and I never made it down, and I never got the opportunity to document her story, to ask the questions I would have wanted to
mm,
ask. And so there's like a bittersweet moment where you learn this lesson, you know, not to take people for granted. And especially in a day and age when we can all, you know, document people's journeys, like there's no sense that someone's story has to be lost to time. Like we can immortalize our family and our friends in the form of videos and interviews and things like that. And so um, it's made me want to do better with that, to be
mm,
there for my family a little bit more, to be curious about their lives. You know, I think about my siblings, I think about my cousins, I think about even my friends, you know, who I might not see
yep.
so frequently. And for whatever reason, because of the distractions of the day, that seems fine with me. And I don't want
Mm,
that to be fine. I want to have an increased curiosity for the people that are in my life.
mm. I'm a big believer in the power of stories, and I can really hear that coming through, you know, what you're saying. Can you articulate that for us? Why are stories so powerful? Stories so important? Recording stories, listening to stories, giving people the opportunity to tell their stories.
You know, I couldn't quote, you know, the statistics that talk about how stories bypass part of your brain. You know, I've heard people talk about that. I never took like a journalism class, I never took like a communications class, and so I can't speak for that, but I can share what stories have done in my own life and in the lives of my friends.
Mhm.
Stories for me, I've seen, have the ability to break down walls.
Mm,
Stories have the ability to communicate truths in a way that facts actually can't. Um,
mhm.
in at least my kind of former way of thinking, on this Western way of thinking, the most compelling thing is data, it's statistics, and
Right.
you know that maybe, you know, there's a place for that, and it is important. Excuse me, but stories really seem to hit home in a way that's lasting. You
Mhm.
know, I could not remember any of the historical dates and figures that I was forced to regurgitate in my world history class when I was in high school. I
Mm,
know very few of those things, but
yes.
stories that people share, those have lasting power. They have sticking power, and it's a way for you to still learn and to still be able to access the same lessons that maybe someone was trying to teach you in a different way. And
Mm,
so, you know, I've been thinking a lot about how I want to operate as a parent, as a father. And you know, I've been feeling more and more when it comes to parenting lessons. There's a connection there that's similar to how, you know, theology is taught or how worldviews are developed. That more is caught than is taught,
right.
and we like to think that it's a classroom is what people need. And I just don't know that that's the case. I don't know that I could agree with that so wholeheartedly anymore, which is really
Yes.
kind of frustrating because so much of my experience has been really honing the muscle of, you know, thinking and logical reasoning and argumentation. And I've felt like
Mm,
that's such a crucial part of who I am. And yet I'm seeing more potency when I tap into storytelling.
mhm, mm. We've got a couple of comments from our
Okay.
viewers. Fred saw the video between yourself and Pa,
Yeah.
um, and it was so nice. God bless you, he says.
That's very kind.
It's kind of related to Mary Ellen, our friend and colleague here, who couldn't join us today, but she's watching. Um, and
Hi, Mary Ellen.
she's
Hope you feel better soon.
we'll hope she feels better. She said, "Hey, I really love your insights and your ministry. I'm just wondering how the experience of making the HOA documentary was different to the convos with non-Adventists and Christians you've had on your YouTube channel, and which do you prefer?" It sort of relates to this conversations that you've been having recently on your YouTube channel. Maybe you can tell us briefly what that ministry looks like for you, and yeah, how this documentary differed or was similar to that experience.
Yeah, so the context is on my channel right now, I run a show called I'm Listening. They are sometimes, if not oftentimes, explicit conversations on belief and the
Mhm.
stories that shape them. So I
Mm.
am very interested in what a person thinks of when they see the world. I'm very curious about how they view kind of like the big picture of things. What really matters in life? What is their purpose?
Yep.
What is ultimate reality? Questions on God. How does this look lived out when it comes to your politics and the way that you treat people? Like I love these big question things. And
Mm.
whereas in the past, I think the way that I would interact with this genre of content would be, well, who's right and who's wrong? Let's have a debate on, the
Right.
Second Amendment. Let's have a debate on abortion. Let's have a debate on the Sabbath, for example. And that's okay. And I think the reason, maybe if I'm honest, the reason why I enjoyed that was because it was a way to kind of like uh, intellectually flex, like, oh, look at me,
Mhm.
I
Mhm.
have all the right arguments, I'm a very wise person, like, like this is really cool. But I don't know that I really have seen a ton of fruit in that type of approach,
Mhm.
outside of the kinds of people who are already predisposed to agree with me to begin with.
Mhm.
I
Mhm.
think that debates seldomly serve the purpose of changing the opponent's perspective. I think it's more just posturing for the people that hold your view who are in the audience around you. Um,
Right.
and so trying to shift how I communicate with people, kind of off this like theological basis that I was talking to you about earlier, I wanted to see what would that look like lived out in the real world.
Mhm.
This actually happened kind of accidentally. One of
Mhm.
the kind of ongoing dialogues I've been having on the internet is with my friend Ronnie, who runs a channel called The Raging Atheist. And
Mhm.
we initially started off as, kind of, I don't know, enemies maybe on the internet. Like he made a series of videos like
Yes.
actively attacking me,
Yep.
calling me all kinds of names
And
and things like that.
at that point, you were that Christian vlogger. That was
Yes,
your sort of branding or your channel. So it was the raging atheist versus that Christian vlogger.
exactly,
Kind of
exactly.
kind of funny.
Yeah, and you can imagine all the ways that would go wrong. And chances are, in the past, I've approached responding in a less than ideal way. But for whatever reason, I didn't in this relationship. And I got to
Mhm.
see what happens when you don't burn the bridge every opportunity that you get to. What does it
Right.
look like to build a bridge rather than to build a wall? Is one way
Mhm.
of saying it. And so
Yep.
what transpired over the next couple of years is we developed the friendship, both online and on each other's, channels and collaborations, where eventually one summer I flew out to where he lived, which actually
Mhm.
kind of ironically was in Battle Creek, Michigan. And so
Yep.
I got to visit him in person and got to like spend time with his daughter and, spend time in his apartment, hanging out, multiple meals together. And something that he told me at the end of that experience sticks with me so strongly. And he says, Justin,
Mhm.
I love this. Thank you so much for coming out here. I feel like I've made a friend for life. And
Wow.
when I think about that, like that's progress. That's meaningful. Not just meaningful in the sense like, one step closer to convert him, but meaningful in the sense like to me, like that feeds my spirit, that feeds my soul, and that makes me feel deeply fulfilled and happy because I feel the same way
Yes.
about his friendship. I'm also grateful that he's in my life. And so my channel
Mm.
has taken this shift because I've kind of accidentally stumbled on the beauty of listening and the ministry of presence and what does this look like. And so we're beginning to see this take place in all kinds of different ways. And most recently, it's surfaced in conversations that I'm having with Alan Parr. Alan Parr is
Yep.
a big YouTuber, over 500,000 subscribers, one of the
Mm.
larger, probably in the top 5 larger Christian YouTubers that are out there.
Mhm.
And a number of months ago, he made a video on Seventh-day Adventism. and he's just, our Adventist, Christian or something along those lines. And the video was actually favorable. Christian or Adventists, they're a little different here and there, but they're pretty cool people. And they're Christian, and more or less thumbs up. The internet responds in the way that you would think that the internet would respond, and really just hammered him really hard. To the point where he retracts the first video and then publishes videos 2, 3, and 4, where he says things like, I was wrong about Seventh-day Adventism. Like he recants everything and makes a whole series of videos, to my estimation, and my language would be really attacking our community of faith. Usually that's not a big deal. Usually my answer is, okay, whatever. If people want to believe what they want to believe, that's fine. The difference, though, is that Al and I have been friends for many years. There was a time in our journeys where I actually had a larger audience than him, and he was calling me for advice, and he and I and another Christian YouTuber were kind of part of this mastermind where we'd give each other advice and pray for each other. So we've known each other for several years. He comes out to Portland on one occasion. I take him out to eat, and we're having a great time. And so I just reach out to him like, dude, like, you couldn't have even like called me, like, even like, hey, at the end of the day, you believe what you want. I'm not going to censor you, but I felt somewhat betrayed as a friend. And because of our friendship, he was willing to sit down and talk. And because of this approach, I didn't immediately feel defensive. Like I had to attack all of his wrong ideas and all the fallacies that he had made and all the assumptions that he had made that were just off. I just heard him. And for 2 hours, I listened to what he had to say. And, on the internet, people don't like that all the time. I've been called so many names over the last month, from, like instrument of Satan to Jesuit to fill in the blank. It's, I've had someone literally write in like, may the Lord curse you. Like, okay, like that's a bold faith that you have in your God there, that he would answer your prayer.
Wow. What kind of God is that?
Right. But the result is that the friendship remains intact. And what it means is that we get to have more conversations and additional dialogue. And even if at the end of the day, we choose to say, hey, you know what, let's just agree to disagree. Let's choose to be friends. I think that that's important. In a day and age where, social media is increasing the divide, we need to see what it looks like to bridge the gap, to engage in the ministry of reconciliation, to use kind of scriptural language around this idea. And all that to say, it's borne a lot of fruit. So I think the question was, though, more specific, that's the context. I'm so sorry to go on that long.
And that's okay. Mary Ellen, I guess, was comparing the difference between making something like HOA, the Humans of Adventism doco series, and what you do on your YouTube, which you've now explained for us. I think there seem to be some crossovers there. But what are the differences and the similarities?
I think it's the same in nearly every way. It's different in how we express it and what the final product looks like. The HOA documentary, you don't see myself, you don't see Caleb, other than in some, cameos and B-roll, Easter egg kind of thing. There's a shot where we are filming his mother, for example, which, is one of the guests on the show, and Caleb is like hiding in the shadow of a tree, and you can see him there. But like it's intentionally leaving us out of the process. Whereas I'm listening does actually, include me in the conversation there. But the heart of it is the exact same. The heart of it really is connection. The heart of it truly is empathy. The heart of it is really to seek to understand rather than to be understood. And I think that that's what's beautiful about this, is that it then shows you that you can actually be a blessing to all kinds of people, to every person really, because who doesn't want to be heard? So oftentimes we assume that everyone's good. We all believe the same thing. Let's go over here. And it makes the church a really cold and empty kind of vacuum of a space. Because we think, well, they already got the Sabbath, they already got the state of the dead. They already got hell, like they got all these beliefs correct. So, well, let's just go over there instead. The ministry of presence is universal. It's meaningful to every person, that you could ever run into. And so that's the beauty of it, is that maybe you don't know how to give a Bible study, maybe you don't know how to preach or play an instrument, but the good news is everyone can listen. Everyone can learn to ask one or two really good questions and then just really give someone space. And I think that if our churches were the kinds of spaces where people felt heard and understood, I think that would radically change the way that people in the community see the value of their local church. I remember reading an article that talked about how attention now is a commodity for only the wealthy. And the way that they painted this picture was the idea that, like, if you're a single mother with several kids who's working 2 or 3 jobs, oftentimes what happens is, they go to a school and they're one of 20 or 30 kids. They come home and they sit in front of the TV. When mom finally gets home, she hands them the iPad just to kind of distract them. So much of their life is passive consumption. Whereas wealthy people have more flexibility, whether it's with a private tutor or a one-on-one, mentor in their life, or maybe just the fact that the parents don't have to work 2 or 3 jobs. It seems as though that presence is a commodity of the elite alone. And so when people can tap into community, when they can tap into a face-to-face, like it's not just a digital face, it's feeding a part of their soul, it's feeding a part of their being that they may actually not get anywhere else. And so if we can hone in on that, like how much more of an impact would we have? Like how big a dent could we make on things like mental illnesses when people feel alone and depressed and discouraged and they have no one to talk to? What would it be like if we just showed up in people's lives willing to hear and to listen and to love through whatever they're going through?
I saw a similar story about a man in Japan who's been hiring himself out as a companion. Basically, I don't know if you saw this one, Justin, but
something like doing nothing in particular or something.
Doing nothing. He hangs out with people. They go to the mall and he stands next to them, and so they look like they've got someone there. He eats a meal at the food court and they sit there together or whatever, and he's just there. It speaks to the disconnectedness of our age, I suppose.
Yeah. Absolutely. And with COVID happening, it's probably exacerbated at this
even
point,
more.
Right?
Yeah. We had a comment from Diego, one of our regular viewers. It's refreshing to hear and to see someone that reaches out and builds bridges. Nowadays, the agree to disagree is becoming a lost art. In the end, we're not necessarily called to convert. That's the work of the Holy Spirit. Our role is to share our stories and point towards Christ. So yeah, there's some truth in that. Thank you, Diego. I wonder if there's a different audience, Caleb. Who's the audience for your HOA documentaries? Is it Adventists? Is it breaking down barriers so that other people see Adventists as more normal? Like, what's the thoughts around the audience of this doco?
I think it is both. Some of the responses that we've heard from Adventists are, this is the first time I've been proud to call myself a Seventh-day Adventist, is one actual quote that I've heard from someone. I think the most common kind of interaction with this series is just finally something that I can show to someone, that I can hand to someone, that I can DM to someone that really captures who I feel we are. There's, how do I say this without getting myself in trouble? There's not a lot of representation of Adventism online, and where there is representation of us online, oftentimes I think large portions of us feel somewhat embarrassed by the way that we're being represented. I think that that's fair to say. That maybe even if we agree with the ultimate point that someone might be trying to make, we kind of like shake our head inwardly in how they're making the point, right? Or the tone.
And it might be the tone, the quality of presentation, the language there could be a number of factors as to why it doesn't quite gel, but it's not something that we can all resonate with every area in, is what you're sort of saying.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know that that's been the case for me too,
Yep.
I'm starting to realize that it's played a role in why I never identified myself as that Adventist vlogger back in the days, was partially
Right.
because I felt like if someone was like, oh, what's an Adventist? And they Googled us, ew, like it's usually really not good. It's usually, 7 out of 10 of the first 10 articles are like our most, fired up detractors, people who are actively trying to kind of, and maybe even rightfully so, tear down the system because of the abuses and the things that they have, the toxicity that they experienced. And so don't even necessarily like feel like it's entirely bad, but it's only one side of the picture, right? There's for every time that there's one of these negative experiences, there's 100 that are having a really fantastic story. And for the 3 that remain, you're thinking like, oh my goodness, I kind of wish that they didn't say a lot of the things that they're saying, or at least how they're saying it. And so for me, this documentary series is both something for Adventists, but it's also something for the non-Adventists. It's the kind of thing that I can finally share to my atheist friend and say, hey, this is who we are. This is what we're about. And you may not love every story in here, but this is who we are as a people group. The way I see it serving Adventists is something that I had to kind of come to terms with. Being raised in Southern California, I had a very large menu, as it were, within Adventism of what I could choose from, what I could see, what I could experience. There was a lot of options. And so for me, Adventism was very much so a kaleidoscope of belief, this beautiful tapestry of all kinds of different things that interact with each other in unique and different ways. But in getting to go to the South, for example, I come to realize that's not the case. That for a lot of Adventists in certain parts of the US, at least, and I don't know what it's like out where you guys are at, but there are certain pockets of the US where there's only one version of Adventism. And the way that it's displayed is that this is not only the right version of Adventism, but all the other versions of Adventism are wrong and evil and fill in the blank. And that's okay, I guess, if you're persuaded by that version of Adventism, but it seems as though that many young people are not. That the type of Adventism that's on display for them to experience often comes across as, a very dogmatic, very maybe even like homophobic or bigoted or closed-minded, anti-science, whatever the case, anti-fun, anti-life, maybe, I don't know, like, and so if I put myself in the shoes of that young Adventist, to now have my eyes open and realize that my local church's expression of Adventism isn't the only expression that exists, and that there's other ways for me to ask the same questions that every Adventist asks. How could a good God burn people consciously, eternally in hell? We can ask those same questions, and we can have the kind of same starting points in our appreciation for Adventist culture and the meaning of the Sabbath and, how to make a great haystack or whatever. We can still kind of have all these shared things that we hold dear, but also have the freedom to say, there's certain elements of this worldview that I don't feel comfortable just swallowing without really thinking. And I think that that's a beautiful thing for Adventists to realize, that there's permission for them to follow their conscience where the Spirit leads them.
Look, Justin, we're running out of time, unfortunately, because I'm really enjoying this conversation, and it's been eye-opening in many ways. But I've got to let you go. It's sort of almost bedtime for you over there.
No problem.
First of all, we'll give people the access to watch some of this. So I'm listening with Justin Khoe is your YouTube channel. All the documentaries are on there, the HOA docos. Is there anywhere else people can access those?
Yeah, I think that's one of the easiest ways to access it. Yep. If my last name is a difficult name for people to spell or remember, you can go to humansofadventism.com. And there's a completely revamped website there. You'll see some of the photography that's been done. You'll see access to all the episodes there, things like that. And so I think that's a great place to start, is the humansofadventism.com.
And we'll put the link in our comments here as well. Is there a last sort of thought? We like to get practical here at Adventist Record, as Christians, as Adventists. Is there a last sort of idea or a message that you'd like us, if we forget everything about this interview. Hopefully we go watch the documentaries. But if there was one thing you could leave with us, what would that be?
Yeah, I think of the kind of stereotypical advice from grandma, right? God gave you 2 ears, one mouth, and that's because we should be listening twice as much as we are speaking. And I'm not great at that advice. I'm not great at that in my real life. The idea of running a show called I'm Listening seems very like imposter syndrome filled, right? Like
Right.
no one has ever accused me in my life of being a great listener. And yet on the internet, people are like, Justin, you're such a great listener. It's like, no, that's an aspirational character that I play for a show. In controlled environments, I can shut up long enough for someone to talk. But that's really kind of where I go. The scripture talk about, let everyone be slow to speak, quick to listen. I think that if we could do that more, I think that that really we could see some really impactful change, both in our communities and the lives of people around us, but also inwardly. I find myself being challenged and changed when I choose to listen to people. I don't know what that means for you or for your listeners or viewers. Who should you be called to listen to? What stories should you expose yourself to give you a more broad perspective of the world? I don't know, but I encourage you to lean in that. For me, it's oftentimes exploring the others when it comes to the Christian worldview that I have, the people that are misrepresented or underrepresented or just demonized and ostracized. In the last year, that's been a lot of conversations with queer people. And really just spending time listening to their stories and hearing where they come from. As I move into the future, it's really spending time trying to understand other religions, other worldviews, other people that have a different way of approaching the world, and seeing, is there a way that we can find common ground and something to celebrate together? And so for me right now, that looks like exploring a religion I've had zero experience with, which is Islam, to pronounce it correctly. I had my first conversation yesterday with a Muslim. I've never had a conversation with a Muslim person in my entire life. And I had a 1.5 hour conversation yesterday, first time in my life. And I found myself correcting a whole host of assumptions that I had made about Muslim people just because of one story. And it does change the way that you view a people group. It does change the way that you interact with them. And so if I could give, one super general piece of advice is go out there, ask questions, and be willing to listen to people's answers.
Beautiful. That's an advice I hope to take better, especially with my wife. She often tells me.
I think all of our wives want us to improve.
I need to listen. They're all out there saying, "Amen, amen." Hey, thanks so much for joining us, Justin. It's been really amazing to see you again, to catch up, and to have you on the program here today. For all of our viewers and those who view this in the future, thanks for joining us today. And we hope to catch you at a similar time next week. God bless, and we'll see you later.